In April 2026, CBS News confirmed that the FBI had officially begun reviewing possible connections between a growing list of scientists, aerospace engineers, and defense researchers who had either died unexpectedly or vanished without explanation. Around the same time, President Donald Trump was asked about the cases after a White House briefing. His answer was short, but it changed the tone of the story overnight. He called it pretty serious stuff. At first, most people treated the incidents as isolated tragedies. A retired Air Force general disappears after leaving his phone and glasses behind in New Mexico. A MIT fusion director is shot outside his own home. A NASA-affiliated rocket engineer vanishes during a morning hike in California. An astrophysicist is murdered on his porch before sunrise. Separate lives, separate cities, separate explanations. But behind the scenes, federal agencies quietly started comparing them together. And that's the part that disturbed investigators. Because when the names were placed side by side, the overlap became impossible to ignore. Jet Propulsion Laboratory, fusion research at MIT, classified aerospace programs, advanced satellite systems, military research tied to some of America's most sensitive technologies. In total, at least 10 cases landed on the radar of federal investigators. Some had obvious explanations, some didn't. But according to reporting from CBS, the FBI began coordinating with agencies including the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense to determine whether any of these deaths and disappearances were connected. And when investigators laid the timelines side by side, one detail kept appearing again and again. The same institutions, the same narrow window of time, and people whose work touched technologies most Americans never even hear about. Before we go further, I want to know this from you. Which case disturbed you first? The missing rocket scientist or the MIT director? Because the deeper this story goes, the harder it becomes to tell where coincidence ends and where something else might begin. The first death barely made news outside the scientific community. Michael David Hicks died on July 30th, 2023, at the age of 59. To most Americans, his name meant nothing. But inside NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Hicks had spent more than 2 decades working on some of the agency's most ambitious missions. He wasn't a public figure. He wasn't the kind of scientist who appeared on magazine covers or gave TED Talks. He was the kind of person who worked quietly behind systems most people never think about until something goes wrong. Hicks contributed to the DART mission, NASA's planetary defense experiment that deliberately crashed a spacecraft into an asteroid to test whether humanity could someday deflect one heading toward Earth. He also worked on Deep Space One, one of NASA's early deep space missions that helped pave the way for future autonomous spacecraft navigation. In interviews and scientific archives, colleagues described him as deeply respected inside JPL. He authored dozens of technical papers. His career stretched across some of NASA's most advanced space research programs. And then, suddenly, he was gone. There was no national press conference, no major NASA tribute, no detailed public explanation of what happened. His death was acknowledged mostly through an obituary shared by family members. Some reports later mentioned ongoing health issues, but publicly, the details remained limited. By itself, none of that was unusual. Scientists die. Institutions move on. Most careers, even important ones, end quietly. But less than a year later, another name appeared: Frank Maywald. Like Hicks, Maywald was also deeply connected to JPL. He was 61 years old and carried the rare title of JPL, Principal Engineer. a designation reserved for individuals considered critical contributors to the laboratory's mission. Maiwald worked on advanced satellite instrumentation and remote sensing systems. Some of his research focused on technologies designed to detect biosignatures, possible indicators of life, on distant moons and planetary environments. In scientific circles, that work mattered enormously. It sat at the intersection of aerospace engineering, planetary science, and future deep space exploration. Friends and colleagues later described him as intensely dedicated to the work, quiet, precise, highly respected. On July 4, 2024, he died in Los Angeles. Again, there was no dramatic public statement explaining what happened. No wave of national media coverage. Just another obituary. Another highly specialized scientist gone within a relatively short span of time. And this is where the internet started paying attention. Not mainstream media at first. Small Reddit communities began discussing the overlap. Aerospace forums noticed both men had ties to JPL. Some users started compiling timelines. Others pushed back immediately, arguing the obvious point. Large scientific institutions employ thousands of people. Over several years, deaths are statistically inevitable. And honestly, that argument was reasonable. At that stage, even many people following the story closely believed the similarities were probably coincidence. But the timing bothered people. Two respected scientists, same institution, similar age range, sensitive aerospace work, minimal public discussion afterward. Nothing about that proved conspiracy, but patterns rarely announce themselves all at once. They begin with small repetitions people almost ignore. Then another detail appears, then another. And eventually, someone asks whether the similarities are still accidental, or whether everyone is looking at the same picture from too close to see it clearly. Because after the second death, the story still could have faded away. But then someone disappeared instead of dying, and that changed the tone completely. By the middle of 2025, the conversation online had started to shift. At first, people were debating unexplained deaths, quiet obituaries, scientists connected to advanced aerospace programs dying within a relatively short period of time. Strange, maybe, but still explainable. Then came the first disappearance. On the morning of June 22, 2025, Monica Reza left for a hike in California's Angeles National Forest near Mount Waterman. According to reports, she was seen heading onto the trail around 9 in the morning. She never came back. Reza was not an inexperienced tourist wandering into dangerous terrain unprepared. She was a veteran aerospace engineer who had worked with both NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Aerojet Rocketdyne, one of America's major aerospace and defense contractors. People familiar with her work said she held patents tied to specialized rocket-related materials used in advanced propulsion systems. Search teams moved into the area quickly. Helicopters scanned the mountains. Ground crews searched trails and ravines repeatedly. Days turned into weeks, then months. Nothing. No confirmed sightings, no body, no phone signal. No clear indication of where she went after entering the trail. And that absence became part of the mystery. Because disappearances in wilderness areas do happen. Every year, experienced hikers get injured, become disoriented, or die from exposure in terrain they thought they understood. Investigators publicly acknowledged there was no confirmed evidence of abduction or foul play in Reza's case. But people following the story online kept returning to one uncomfortable detail. Monica Reza was another person connected to sensitive aerospace technology. Another highly specialized figure. Another name now attached to the growing timeline. Then, 8 months later, Another disappearance pushed the story into an entirely different category. On February 27, 2026, retired Air Force Major General Neil McCasland walked out of his home in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and vanished. Friends and family later said he left behind his phone, prescription glasses, and fitness devices. For many observers, that detail stood out immediately. Modern disappearances almost always leave digital traces behind. Phones move, watches ping towers, fitness trackers generate location histories. In this case, there was almost nothing. McCasland wasn't just a retired military officer. During his career, he had overseen highly sensitive Air Force and defense programs. He had also previously commanded Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a facility long associated, fairly or unfairly, with some of the most secretive aerospace research in American military history. Online speculation exploded almost instantly. Some theories became absurd within hours. Others were more restrained. Former military personnel and investigators pointed out something simpler. McCasland was an experienced outdoorsman and survival expert. People who knew him described him as mentally sharp and physically capable. This wasn't someone expected to disappear accidentally without leaving a trace. And then another detail surfaced that caught public attention. The FBI joined the search effort. To be clear, that does not automatically imply conspiracy. The FBI often assists in missing persons cases involving federal personnel, military figures, or situations crossing jurisdictions. Publicly, investigators still stated there was no confirmed evidence of foul play. But emotionally, the atmosphere had changed. 2 deaths at JPL might feel like coincidence. A missing aerospace engineer and a vanished Air Force general felt different. Because fear enters stories through uncertainty. People are more unsettled by disappearances than deaths. A death creates an ending. A disappearance creates endless possibilities. Some innocent, some terrifying. And by this point, online communities were no longer asking whether the cases were strange. They were asking whether anyone inside the federal government was quietly asking the same question. Because the timeline was growing, the institutions were overlapping, and the people involved all seemed connected to worlds built around secrecy, defense, advanced technology, and classified research. Then the story took a darker turn. Because the next scientists weren't missing. They were shot. The story stopped feeling theoretical in December 2025. That was when one of the most respected fusion researchers in the United States was shot outside his own home. Nuno Loureiro was 47 years old and served as director of MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center, one of the world's leading institutions studying nuclear fusion. The long-promised technology capable of producing enormous amounts of clean energy by recreating the same reactions that power stars. At the time, fusion research had become intensely strategic. The United States, China, and multiple European programs were all racing toward breakthroughs that could reshape global energy systems and national security priorities for decades. Governments were investing billions. Private companies were competing aggressively. And scientists working in the field were suddenly operating inside one of the most high-stakes technological environments on Earth. Friends and colleagues described Loureiro as brilliant but approachable. In statements released after his death, MIT officials called him a deeply admired teacher and researcher, whose influence extended far beyond the laboratory. On the evening of December 15, 2025, Loureiro returned to his home in Brookline, Massachusetts. Someone shot him multiple times. He was transported to a hospital and died the next morning. For weeks, very little information was released publicly. That silence created exactly the kind of vacuum the internet tends to fill on its own. By then, online discussions had already connected the earlier JPL deaths and the disappearances of Monica Reza and Neil McCasland. Now the director of a major fusion research center had been murdered. Speculation exploded. Then, months later, investigators identified a suspect, Claudio Manuel Neves Valente, a former classmate reportedly motivated by personal resentment and long-standing grievances. Officially, authorities described the killing as personal, not espionage-related. And that distinction matters, because one of the easiest mistakes in stories like this is forcing unrelated tragedies into a single narrative simply because they happen close together. Law enforcement never publicly linked Loureiro's murder to foreign intelligence, classified sabotage, or a coordinated operation. But emotionally, the timing still unsettled people. A fusion director, murdered during the exact same period multiple aerospace scientists were disappearing or dying unexpectedly, felt impossible for many observers to ignore. And before the public could process that case fully, another scientist was attacked. On February 16, 2026, sheriff's deputies responded to reports of violence at a home in Llano, a remote desert community in Los Angeles County. They found astrophysicist Carl Grillmair shot on his porch. Grillmair had spent decades at Caltech and NASA-affiliated research institutions, studying exoplanets, near-Earth objects, and deep space astronomy. Colleagues credited him with important discoveries involving water vapor on planets outside our solar system, work tied to the broader scientific search for potentially habitable worlds. People who worked alongside him described him as intensely curious and deeply committed to science. The kind of researcher who spent a lifetime asking questions humanity still couldn't answer. Now he was dead, outside his own home, before sunrise. Authorities later arrested a suspect connected to burglary and carjacking crimes in the area. Publicly, investigators suggested the killing may have occurred during criminal activity rather than a targeted assassination. Again, officially, there was no confirmed conspiracy. But by this point, something important had changed psychologically. The public was no longer looking at isolated incidents. People had started building a narrative. And once narratives form, every new case begins attaching itself to the larger fear surrounding it. Then came the case that disturbed people in an entirely different way. Amy Eskridge. Unlike the others, Eskridge was already surrounded by controversy before her death. She was an experimental propulsion researcher and co-founder of the Institute for Exotic Science in Huntsville, Alabama. In interviews and online discussions, she spoke openly about fringe propulsion concepts, including claims involving anti-gravity research. It is important to be careful here. There is no verified public evidence that Eskridge discovered anti-gravity technology, despite what many conspiracy channels later claimed. Much of the online mythology around her case grew after her death, often mixing documented statements with speculation and rumor. But what is documented is this. People close to Eskridge later said she believed she was being harassed, sabotaged, or targeted in some way. She reportedly made statements expressing fear and distrust before her death. On June 11, 2022, she died from what authorities ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Afterward, clips of old interviews spread rapidly online. Supporters pointed to comments where she allegedly insisted she was not suicidal. Others argued her emotional state appeared increasingly unstable in the years leading up to her death. And that uncertainty made the case uniquely combustible online. Because unlike the others, Eskridge's story already sounded like a conspiracy before anyone connected it to the broader timeline. That made her case powerful fuel for internet speculation. And once her name entered the conversation, the entire story darkened. Not because investigators confirmed a hidden operation, but because people emotionally stopped trusting coincidence. At this point, federal agencies could no longer ignore the overlap. And I want to ask you something here. Which case do you think investigators should be looking at most closely? Because by now, this no longer looked like a series of random headlines people happened to place side by side. It looked like a pattern. Even if nobody could yet prove what the pattern meant, for months, most major news organizations stayed cautious. The story lived mainly in smaller online communities, aerospace forums, Reddit threads, and independent commentary channels. Some people were convinced something larger was happening. Others dismissed the entire discussion as conspiracy thinking, fueled by coincidence and internet paranoia. Then, CBS News published a report that changed the conversation. Not because it confirmed an assassination campaign, but because it confirmed something far more important. Federal agencies were taking the overlap seriously enough to review the cases together. According to CBS reporting, the FBI had begun looking for connections between multiple deaths and disappearances involving scientists, engineers, and personnel connected to sensitive government laboratories and research institutions. The report stated that the FBI was coordinating with agencies including the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. That alone dramatically changed public perception. Because once the FBI enters a story, people stop treating it like internet folklore. Then came another development. Members of the House Oversight Committee reportedly sent letters to federal agencies requesting information related to the cases. Public pressure had started building fast. Questions were spreading beyond conspiracy communities and into mainstream political discussion. And then, President Donald Trump was asked directly about the situation. His response was brief, but powerful. Pretty serious stuff. He added that he hoped the incidents were coincidence, but said officials were looking into them. That statement mattered because presidents are extremely careful about commenting on ongoing federal investigations involving national security implications. Even vague language can reshape public perception instantly. And overnight, the tone changed. Now people weren't just asking whether the stories were strange. They were asking what federal authorities had seen that made them willing to discuss the issue publicly at all. Then, FBI Director Kash Patel added another phrase that fueled even more speculation. He stated that if investigators uncovered nefarious conduct or conspiracy, arrests would be made. That word, nefarious, spread everywhere online. Videos exploded across YouTube and TikTok. Headlines became more dramatic by the hour. Some creators immediately jumped to claims involving foreign intelligence operations, targeted eliminations, or covert attacks on American scientists. But this is where the story requires careful separation between fact and interpretation. There is a massive difference between investigators looking for links and investigators proving a conspiracy. Those are not the same thing. When federal agencies examine overlapping cases, it does not automatically mean they already believe a coordinated operation exists. Investigators routinely review patterns to determine whether similarities are meaningful or merely statistical. And publicly, authorities repeatedly emphasized something many viral videos ignored. No confirmed evidence of coordinated attacks had been established. That distinction matters enormously. In fact, CBS itself reported that, despite reviewing the timeline and interviewing multiple individuals connected to the cases, They found no confirmed links proving the deaths and disappearances were connected. Several investigators and experts interviewed in connection with the story reportedly saw no obvious evidence of a coordinated campaign. Some cases already had plausible explanations. Nuno Loureiro's alleged killer had been identified, with investigators pointing toward personal grievances rather than espionage. Carl Grillmair's death appeared tied to violent criminal activity. Jason Thomas's family believed grief and emotional distress played a major role in his disappearance. Even in the missing persons cases, officials publicly stated there was no confirmed evidence of abduction. And yet, the concern inside Washington still seemed real. Because from a federal perspective, even the possibility of overlap involving sensitive scientific personnel creates serious national security anxiety. That's the part many people miss. Investigators do not need proof of conspiracy before they begin quietly checking whether one exists, especially when the people involved worked around aerospace systems, fusion research, military infrastructure, or advanced defense technology. Sometimes the danger is not what investigators know, it is what they cannot yet rule out. And psychologically, that uncertainty became the engine driving the entire story forward. Skeptics looked at the timeline and saw coincidence amplified by the internet. Others looked at the same timeline and saw warning signs nobody wanted to say out loud. And somewhere in the middle sat the FBI, publicly acknowledging the overlap, while stopping far short of confirming any larger operation, which trapped the public in a deeply uncomfortable place between skepticism and fear. Because if there is no conspiracy, why did these cases create so much alarm inside Washington? At this point in the story, it becomes very tempting to force everything into a single dramatic explanation. Secret assassinations, foreign intelligence operations, a coordinated effort to eliminate scientists tied to America's most sensitive technologies. But the truth is more complicated, and honestly, more unsettling. Because the real pattern may not be murder. The real pattern may be fear. Think about what these cases actually involved. Aerospace engineers, fusion researchers, military officials connected to classified programs, scientists working inside institutions most people will never enter, JPL, MIT's fusion labs, Caltech, defense contractors, military research infrastructure. Now place all of that inside the world of the mid-2020s. The United States and China are locked in intense technological competition. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, aerospace systems, satellite warfare, energy independence, hypersonics, fusion research. Every breakthrough now carries geopolitical consequences. Scientific research no longer feels separate from national security. In many cases, it is national security. That creates enormous psychological pressure around secrecy. And secrecy changes how people interpret events. When an ordinary person disappears, the public usually assumes tragedy first. When someone connected to classified aerospace programs disappears, people instinctively search for hidden explanations. Not necessarily because evidence exists, but because the surrounding world already feels opaque. And uncertainty is where pattern seeking begins. Human beings are wired to connect dots, especially during periods of fear or instability. Psychologists have studied this for decades. When people face incomplete information, the brain starts building narratives to reduce uncertainty. Coincidences become signals. Gaps in information become suspicious. Silence becomes evidence. The internet accelerates that process dramatically. One Reddit thread becomes 50. A missing person timeline turns into a viral TikTok. YouTube creators combine unrelated events into a single cinematic story structure. Algorithms reward mystery, escalation, and emotional tension far more than careful nuance. And once a narrative gains momentum online, every new event starts reinforcing the larger mythology around it. That doesn't mean the concerns are imaginary. Far from it. Even federal investigators appeared concerned enough to review the overlap carefully. From a national security perspective, they almost had to. If multiple individuals connected to sensitive research die or disappear within a compressed period of time, responsible agencies cannot simply ignore the possibility of linkage. But reviewing a possibility is not the same as proving one. That distinction slowly disappeared online. And maybe that's because modern society already feels primed for stories like this. Trust in institutions is fragile. Government secrecy creates suspicion even when secrecy is legitimate. Classified programs naturally produce informational voids, and human beings are deeply uncomfortable with voids. So people fill them, sometimes with reasonable questions, sometimes with fantasy, and sometimes with fears that reveal more about society than the cases themselves. Because underneath this entire story sits a deeper emotional truth. These scientists worked in worlds most people never see: fusion laboratories, planetary defense systems, advanced propulsion research, military aerospace infrastructure. Their work touched technologies capable of reshaping the future, yet most of their lives unfolded quietly behind secured doors, technical papers, and restricted facilities. To the public, these environments already feel mysterious before anything bad even happens. So when tragedy enters those worlds, the mystery expands instantly. Not because every event is connected, but because secrecy itself changes how human beings experience uncertainty. And maybe that's why these stories spread so quickly. Not because people desperately want conspiracy theories to be true, but because people desperately want uncertainty to make sense. Somewhere tonight, there is still an empty hiking trail in the mountains above Los Angeles. Somewhere, there is still a dark front porch in the California desert where neighbors woke to flashing police lights before sunrise. And somewhere in Albuquerque, a pair of untouched glasses still sits inside the home of a retired Air Force general who walked outside one morning and never returned. As of now, the FBI investigation remains ongoing. No federal agency has confirmed a coordinated conspiracy. No public evidence has proven that these scientists, engineers, and military figures were targeted as part of a single operation. Several cases may ultimately have ordinary, though tragic, explanations. But not all of the questions have gone away. That's why the story continues to spread. Not because people are certain they've found the answer, but because uncertainty itself can feel haunting when it surrounds people connected to powerful institutions and technologies most of us barely understand. And maybe the truth, when it finally arrives, will look very different from the stories the internet has already written. Maybe it will end up being less cinematic and more human. A series of tragedies people tried to force into one narrative because randomness is difficult to accept. Or maybe investigators will eventually uncover connections nobody can yet see from the outside. Right now, nobody knows. But if you think these families deserve real answers, leave a comment below. Because some mysteries become smaller with time. Others only grow louder.